if Agentix is sort of stage 4 and you want to get started, like you have to have the data mechanized. And so, you'd be surprised, but a lot of people still have like, maybe not analog, but let's call it landlocked repositories of information. In some cases, it is analog. It's like, well, we have these order sheets and then somebody keys them in. It's like, well, that's not really mechanization.
Welcome to Technovation. I'm your host, Peter High. My guest today is Joe Inzerillo. Joe is the Executive Vice President and Chief Digital Officer of Salesforce, a pioneering cloud-based customer relationship management platform that earned nearly $38 billion in its fiscal 2025, ending in January. Joe has traditional IT responsibilities as the CIO of the company reports to him, but he also focuses on how Salesforce uses its own technology, leading the development and internal deployment of Agentforce, Salesforce's AI-powered digital labor platform. He's been in his role for roughly 6 months, and prior to it, Joe was the Chief Product and Technology Officer of SiriusXM and the Chief Technology Officer of Disney Streaming Services. Joe, welcome to Technovation. It's great to speak with you today.
Thanks for having me, Peter.
That's a pleasure. Well, Joe, most people who would be watching or listening to this would certainly be familiar with Salesforce, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to describe the business in your own words if you take a minute to do so.
Well, Salesforce is one of the preeminent, if not the preeminent, enterprise software companies out there. We're obviously really well known for our CRM, customer relationship management software. But we have sales and service and industry-specific clouds for all sorts of applications and things like that. So it's a very large company, over 75,000 employees worldwide, and we do a lot of really cool stuff. And of late, that's included a ton of agentic work, which I think we're going to get into today.
I'm looking forward to doing so, certainly, Joe. Before we do, though, I'd love to have just a brief overview of your role as Chief Digital Officer as well. It's a title that a number of people have, but means different things in different companies. How does it apply in a company like yours?
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement of it meaning a bunch of different things. In my role, it's an interesting space that we've sort of carved out here at Salesforce, and I think it's this sort of fusion of two things. So one thing that I oversee is the office of the CIO. So your standard, like, how do we get conference rooms and laptops and networks and all that sort of thing. And so I have a CIO who reports to me that oversees all that, but it's, critically important stuff. And I think we do a really good job of it, and we always endeavor to do better. But a lot of the focus of my time is really focused on how we use our technology for our purposes. And so coming into this the same way that I've, done at Disney and SiriusXM and Major League Baseball and a bunch of places before that, where I was a Salesforce customer, coming in and saying, like, how do I use the tools that we have to sort of relentlessly pursue the mission of Salesforce, being a company and selling and marketing and doing all those functions in the way that, I really have approached it almost like this direct to consumer mindset of like continuous improvement and continuous deployment, and using all of the stuff that we have at Salesforce to bring that to bear. And that fuels this thing that we call Customer Zero, which is us using our own technology, using the learnings from that to improve it, and then shipping that to our customers. And there's a real virtuous cycle there where sometimes I'm sprinting out ahead of our product team and trying things out that informs the product decisions. And other times I'm using the things that they have and really putting to work for Salesforce to achieve, whatever goal we're going after.
Well, you mentioned that you're a past customer of the company before joining the company itself. I wonder what insights that provided you in coming into role. Unusual for you, presumably, perhaps relative to past posts of having worked collaboratively with this as a strategic partner of yours, now joining the firm itself. Talk a bit about your impressions prior to joining the firm.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I mean, I've worked with Salesforce on a number of different dimensions. And so Salesforce acquired things that I loved as part of it. So I was a big Tableau user for, a decade and a half, a big Slack user for almost that long, probably 12 years, which are companies that we own now or brands that we own that are integrated into the Salesforce platform. And so I think I've sort of seen that side of it. I've also deployed Salesforce, predominantly CRM, a little bit of service as well in previous roles. And so I think coming in, I had this customer mindset, kind of knew what I thought I was getting into as far as sort of the platform side of it. And then, you sort of get on the inside and you see the inside of the room, and some of the things you thought were immovable are movable, and some of the things you thought were movable are maybe not as easy to move. when you sort of see the stuff behind the scenes. But overall, I wouldn't have I would never have described myself as a Salesforce fanboy, but as my first job at enterprise software, I'm really enjoying it. And I'm really enjoying what we have and kind of the potential that we have. Yeah, I think we're just barely scratching the surface, because I think, when I think about the agentic revolution and like agentic enterprises and things like that, it feels like a lot of the stuff that Salesforce has been doing almost on intuition of acquiring these companies and putting these things together makes so much more sense when you overlay agents on them, right? They sort of cease becoming these bespoke functional solves and now really start to become this, operating system for the agentic enterprise. And I see that more from the inside than I necessarily saw from the outside. So from the outside, I really saw it much more as the product catalog. And from the inside, I really understand the potential to connect these things together in a more meaningful way.
How interesting. Well, you've noted that the future of work is increasingly agentic. You referenced something akin to that a little bit earlier in this conversation, the digital agents collaborating alongside humans, driving efficiency, customer success, scale, and the like. Talk a bit about your perspectives relative to the advances of agentic AI, which still in the grand scheme of things is a fairly new concept. Talk about where we are now and what excites you as you look to the future.
Yeah, it's funny. I've been doing like applied AI work for almost 30 years at this point. And so on one hand, when we talk about this large model and generative AI and agents and things like that, it seems like it's so new. And to some degree it is. And then at the same time, it also seems like it is just continuation of these, step function plateau grow advancements that we made in AI along the way. And I think the more advanced that we get with the agentics, it is very, very different. It's a very different way of thinking about things. It's not procedural. It's not as deterministic inherently, things like that. But a lot of the techniques that we used for other AI development, I think are equally appropriate, and in some cases, like coming back into vogue in the agentic side of it. But I do think just the nature of it and the size of that step function, and more importantly, I think the pace at which that step function has happened, I think is going to drive real change in companies. That's of course going to take time to propagate. But one of the things that I'm doing here is trying to propagate it as fast as possible inside of our company, and that's part a technology sort of challenge, and it's also a people challenge. Not necessarily the people themselves, but just the structures that we have built that are inherently people driven. The way that we parcel out work is like a job, right? As opposed to a job to be done. And AI doesn't really think, trying to replace a person's whole job with an AI doesn't seem likely anytime soon. But the ability to like enhance what people are doing or take certain portions of their job and let the AI do it, that we're already doing. We're well into the throes of that. So when I think about overall, I really think that it's going to have a profound impact in the way that we do work. But I think it will be in the ways that maybe are unexpected as to what people sort of would have prognosticated 2 years ago when ChatGPT bust onto the scene.
Well, yeah, Joe, the many people who are watching or listening to this are peers of yours, perhaps in organizations that aren't quite as tech forward as an organization like Salesforce. And I'd love to have you walk through, and maybe even double click on some of the things you just described in terms of the pathway to take advantage of what you have just suggested, in terms of ensuring that the broader workforce, tech resources, non-tech resources alike, develop greater familiarity with the power of AI, generally speaking, agentic AI more specifically, generative AI also, of course, a relevant topic here also, and how they can get over some of the people challenges that you described. As you point out, it's not going to take over all jobs or even anything close to that, but it is going to be very important that all people, again, tech team and non-tech team alike, incorporate the use of AI into their daily workflows in very meaningful ways. Can you talk a bit about what you've seen, whether it's reflections of your own education, what you've seen work well at a very tech-forward organization like Salesforce, and beyond that, kind of the application to businesses that might be hoping to emulate a pathway akin to what you've hewn across your experiences?
Maybe I'll start a little bit with a little setup about the way I think about it, which is, if you look at all technological advances, talking about, the wheel to like the cotton gin to, flight and things like that. They're all driven by people. And there was always a skills gap and an education gap when these things first started. So there was sort of this thing where, okay, well, people don't know how to smelt bronze. But a couple of people figured it out, and then they taught some more people, and they taught some more people, and then it got institutionalized. Then it became an occupation. Then it was a trade. All those sorts of things. But the fundamental people's capabilities were sort of the same, right? We have intellect, we have reasoning ability, we have hands. You can sort of take the capability set of the human and just say, like, look, the gap is really knowledge, the gap is training and education, but fundamentally anybody could do that job given the right set of circumstances. When you talk about agentics, this is a very different thing now. The agentic AIs that we're working with right now are not the same as we are. And we tend to anthropomorphize them. In fact, I think over anthropomorphize them, especially when ChatGPT first started, of imbuing them with all this like knowledge and reasoning and things like that they just don't have yet. And so like they're not really good at speculation. They're not really good in uncertainty. And they're inherently, in some cases, not as deterministic as people are, because they do have these hallucinations on occasion. They do have these things that are real affectations of the technological nature of what they are. And so when you start to think about how do you incorporate these into the workforce, it's not just a matter of enabling or training people. You really have to think about dividing the work differently. And, the humans are pretty plastic. The technology is advancing at the rate that it's advancing. So I think if you're going to start to really incorporate AI in a very meaningful way, you kind of have to start with what is AI good at? And then build sort of job functions around that. So, this slew of work to be done, the AI is really good at things that are, particularly tedious, that require a lot of scale. If you're talking about a sales agent, things that have a very low win rate with humans so that it's hard to find humans or hard to justify humans doing those jobs, things like that. You can say, okay, well, the AI is really good at that. And then you sort of figure out how to putty the people around that AI to make things better and to fulfill like the sort of fulsome needs of the business. But I think you sort of have to start with the acknowledgement that it's a very different type of workforce. And if you're just treating it like an intern, you're not really going to get that far, because even your intern, which may not have anywhere near the domain expertise or skill or experience of a tenured employee, still has human-like reasoning capabilities that these AIs just don't have right now. And so I think part of that is, a lot of reasons that people fail is they either expect too much or too little of the AI. They're like on both sides of no man's land. So they either, want to use the AI like, well, I'm just going to use it to summarize emails. And you're like, okay, well, that's cool, but it's probably not transformative. Or they really like, no, I'm going to replace all my salespeople with AIs. And you're like, well, yeah, that's probably not going to work either. So like, yeah, AIs could do portions of the sales job very well. But the whole sales job, they're not going to do very well. And it's just sort of the state of the technology that we're at. But that fusion between the human workforce and the AI workforce, kind of on the AI's terms, like the AI dictating terms based upon its capabilities, I think is the future of the agentic enterprise. Because that really allows you to take advantage of what it can do and the acceleration it can provide in the economy of scale and things like that, but also just really empower the people to deliver much more than they were able to in the past, because in many ways they're unlocked from all this drudgery that goes along with every job that we do.
How do you think about measuring the success or validating the improvements related to what you have described? One of the fascinating aspects of the work of agentic AI is the collaboration with humans, and so elevating the work that humans do, perhaps to eliminating or taking away some of the drudgery of ongoing tasks, for example, so that the human begins the task at an elevated place, for instance, as well. I wonder, how do you think about, and I recognize the success metrics will differ depending upon where it is applied, but generally speaking, as you think about the collaboration between a human and artificial intelligence, how do you think about evaluating the success or lack thereof of that?
No, I think it's a totally valid question. And I don't think anybody has completely, solidified answers at this point. But the way that I really think about it is sort of two axes. You have kind of one axis of, okay, this is a thing that humans do that I want the AI to do. And so at that point in time, what you really need is instrumentation. So it's not an accident, for example, that, both at Salesforce here before I got here, and also with me at SiriusXM using Agentic, one of the use cases that's been very successful is sort of the customer service use case, especially chat, where a lot of people go to solve problems or ask questions. Well, part of the reason that chat is or the service use case of chat is such a great use case for an AI is we've already built instrumentation around the process that's incredibly robust. And so if you think about people who have a call center, maybe in the Philippines or things like that, the average tenure of a call center agent is, 18 months on average. They cycle fast, like we just said. And so you have to have like a abundance of accurate training material. You have to come up with these KPIs like call handle time and customer satisfaction and all these other things. And all of that stuff existed before agents did. So when you go to slide an agent in, you can just sort of say, okay, well, here's the KPIs. I just got to make sure that the agent can do as good or better than the human in these KPIs. But you're already in this incredibly well-instrumented, well-orchestrated, very mature path. And so I think that's why the customer service use cases were just the ones that emerged first. But if you take like a sales use case, well, that's a lot tougher. It's not like a point of sale thing where it just happens like instantaneously. So, if you're trying to sell, let's say, software like we are, or services like we are, it's multiple calls, multiple meetings, understanding what the client needs, understanding what we have on offer, where we could potentially stretch what we have on offer, where those client needs might be more flexible. There's a lot of nuance to that, and it happens over a long period of time. So at the end of the day, you would probably argue, well, look, I'm going to look at win rate. But that's a very long converging stat. And again, as the AI is not going to do the whole job, it's sort of augmented humans versus straight up humans. And like getting all the noise out of that system requires just a lot of samples, a lot of at-bats, as we would say in baseball, to really determine. But I think you can look at things like we've done with our SDR agent as an example, which I think is, we're calling it sales agent now, but it's basically a sales development representative where we get a lead. Let's say somebody would go to the website and they would fill out a form and they attend, let's say, a Slack webinar. And that would be a lead. And we would score those leads and say, okay, well, of all these leads that come in, over a certain threshold, these are really good leads. And we would send humans to follow up and see if they wanted to buy some of our product. I hope you enjoyed that Slack webinar. Would you like to buy Slack? And that's, generally an entry-level kind of sales position where you're really developing these things. And this is really principally, I'm speaking mostly of like small businesses and, not your enterprises that are sort of more well-established relationships. And so when you think about that sales development rep, one thing you could say is, okay, well, what's the win rate, close rate, et cetera, with those sales development folks? But where we decided to start was we don't necessarily have the ability to really follow up with everybody with humans. So the folks that were scored, as a propensity for us to potentially sell to them, there's a huge number of those folks that get more automated responses because they don't seem very likely to convert. And so what we started is saying, like, look, right now, we're not really doing much with these leads. The win rate is extremely low because we believe the propensity to be low of this is. And our testing has proven that our propensity scores were pretty accurate, directionally. The win rate on those might only be 1 in 100 or 1 in 500. And even if you could theoretically afford a human to go do it, like no human being wants to get told 99 times out of 100 that they're not interested. Like that's kind of a miserable job. So you don't really even have humans that would want to go do that job. But we built this SDR agent and we're now having it follow up. So for these leads that are below the threshold, the SDR agent is doing a synthetic version of that very entry level job, like trying to get to the point of booking a meeting or trying to, hook people up with the appropriate resources on our side. And it works. The hit rate is non-zero. It's still relatively low, but it's much better than it was with a just sort of rigid augmentation system that was built on, procedural rules and things like that. The agent is much more dynamic. It starts to get scores and starts to get a feeling that's a lot closer to what a human would be. And it does a great job of developing it. And I like to use the analogy. That's a good example with sawdust on the floor. And I don't know if you've ever heard this story, but when Henry Ford was making the Model T, the majority of the Model T was still wood, right? So they're cutting at this industrial scale that had never really been seen before, all these wood products, and they're they didn't know what to do with the sawdust. So it just kept piling up on the floor, and they were burning it. They were like putting it in the lake and stuff like that to get rid of it. And so Henry Ford wound up calling one of his cousins and said, hey, I need you to deal with this sawdust. And so that guy invented charcoal briquettes. And so they were originally called Ford Charcoal, and the name of his cousin was Kingsford. So when you see those blue and white bags of Kingsford charcoal, that all came from the byproduct of the Henry Ford factory in the form of charcoal briquettes. And so I think that's a pretty good example of where we started with that use case, because there was very little downside risk, and it gave us a lot of liberty to experiment. And what we wound up doing is converting those leads that were previously essentially doing nothing for the company into real pipeline that we could monetize. And that's a good example of where you start. As we get more reps with that, now we can start talking about saying, okay, well, of the human reps, what portions of their job can this thing augment to expand the capabilities of that human workforce to do an even better job of following up with customers and things like that. But I think that's kind of a magic sales use case, because a lot of people have that sort of notion of a sales development representative. But I think the key thing to your macro question is really having kind of a vision for where the AI can be successful in this, other than just, I wish it to be successful. Like, where do we have the right amount of instrumentation on both the humans and the AIs doing a job so we can compare? And where can I afford to take some chances on this? Because the odds of the AI working straight out of the box are probably not great. So you're going to have to iterate and tune and really, teach it your company, teach it, things that you want it to say, things you don't want it to say. And, we provide great tooling for that in Agentforce, but every company is a little bit different. So I think you get much further out of the box with Agentforce than some other solutions out there, but you still have to make it your own, not unlike hiring an employee and training them and getting them to work for your company, not just work for a company.
Yeah, great examples across the board. Good analogies also offered there. I appreciate that. I want to get back to the extent to which you have a customer zero set of responsibilities, and you lead the development and internal deployment of Agentforce. Talk a bit. You've begun to talk a bit about your experience with that, but I'm also interested by the way in which it helps you become an advocate to your peer group outside of Salesforce, your former cohort as heads of technology and digital and product in the kinds of companies that are now Salesforce's customers. Can you talk a bit about that advantage you have of being customer zero and the empathy it provides you in working with or perhaps collaborating with your peers outside of the organization?
Well, first off, I love the word empathy that you use, because I think it's really there. It's true empathy. Like, I've been in your shoes before. And what I would say at Salesforce that I've always liked, I liked when I was outside the company, and I appreciate being on the other side of it inside the company, is the fact that Salesforce does occasionally hire their customers. And those folks come in with their learnings and their perspective. And, being able to talk to folks, like executive sponsors and things like that I've had throughout my career before Salesforce, being able to do that same thing on the reverse side. So we have, for example, a CIO council that I chair that allows us to bring together all these CIOs from, select companies across the world, and just have a conversation and, get really frank, honest, like, what are we doing well? What are we not doing well? So I think that, being able to have that, have a company that's really committed to that kind of transparency and openness, I think is number one. Not necessarily every company is willing to have feedback or work with customers in that way. I also think that just having done the job and like understanding how hard it is to stitch together all of these technological solutions out there. Like, of course, we'd like to provide all of your technology, but we don't make everything that you need as a technologist. There are certain things that we just don't do as a company. And there are certain choices you may have made that aren't our thing in that particular category, but you might have our thing in 5 other categories. And so I think talking to my peers, it's really helpful to be able to say, like, look, I understand what you're going through. I've worked with party X, or I've worked with tool Y. And here's how I think about integrating those things. And, we have third parties that we use inside the company too, back to we don't make everything. And just giving our experiences out like that. And when it comes to the agentic side, really trying to be open kimono with it. So I've met with a ton of customers already since I've been here, probably in the dozens of customers in my 5 months here. And a lot of them are just looking for advice about how would you get started if you were in my shoes. And so it's a little bit of like, business consulting, while you're there too, is just say, well, look, as a fellow technologist, this is the way I would decompose the problem. And I really appreciate that about Salesforce. I think it's one of those things that comes from a very genuine place of like, we know that we will be, Mark always says like, do well by doing good, kind of thing. And I think we really are committed to the fact that we think we can do well by our customers because we need to make them successful. And, our success as a company is only going to be limited or is principally limited by our customer success or successful ability to successfully implement our product. And so we take it pretty seriously. But I think it's nice coming from, I'm glad I arrived here at the point in my career when I did, because I think I have enough experience doing this enough times with enough companies and enough technology stacks that it makes me pretty well read. And so I've seen a lot, maybe most of the patterns out there in a lot of these things, and it really helps me provide some counsel to folks. And I'm not alone. There's a lot of folks in Salesforce that have, different perspectives, different industries and things like that, but have that same kind of experience. And it's a real big part of the culture here that we try to share that and also take input. When you run into a customer that's got a problem that you haven't seen, you're like, oh, wow, that's a good problem. Let me figure that out. And, I'm sort of naturally inquisitive. So I want to see that problem figured out and, rally the troops internally to figure out how we can solve it. And often it's not even our technology. It's really just a technology overall kind of roadmap. And we're a part of it. But, if we can help people just do their job better or do the job to be done better, then we're going to do that. And like I said, I really appreciate that about the company.
One of the things, Joe, is I think about chief digital officers, your peer group, at least with the title, that is very different, is oftentimes, from the role that you currently have, is oftentimes the preponderance of digital talent, depending upon how the CDO role is structured, perhaps the technology talents, the preponderance of that is within their organization. Perhaps it's a retailer, or it's some sort of a manufacturing organization, for instance. There may be profound technology outside of IT, but or the digital domain, but still the majority of the tech talent is within that space. You've worked actually in the past as well, but all the more so now in an organization where there is tremendous technology talent beyond your organization. And I wonder what opportunities and challenges there are in collaborating with people. On the one hand, you don't have to convince anyone about the sanctity of technology and digital advances and the need to lean forward in those ways. On the other hand, that you're speaking with people that are as knowledgeable as you, perhaps, in a lot of the things, and perhaps more so, and depending upon the topic that you're raising. And I wonder the I won't say advantages, disadvantages, but the intricacies of a role like yours in such a technically sophisticated organization like Salesforce.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. It's a great observation. When I think about it, in my career, most of what I've had to do that was outside of the actual technology was convince people that it was a good thing to use technology. And then also, sort of deal with the fact that most people were not as well read in. And so you get to Salesforce, especially, for example, at the commercial side, I got to Salesforce, I saw the commercial team. I was like, wow, these people are impressive. Like, our commercial team is impressive. And they are really well read in on technology by and large. It's just they're a technologically sophisticated sales team. And so like that part is just like a joy, quite honestly, to not have to do that part of the job. I think, the fun thing is you get into trying to really solve the hard problems when you have the kind of talent we do and you have the kind of organizational structure. So I'm the chief digital officer, but I report into the product organization. So Steve Fisher, our chief product officer, is my boss, as he is the boss for everybody else who's in the product side. And so my peers are, the GM of Slack and the GM of, Sales Cloud and the, GM of Tableau and things like that. And so when we have staff meetings, we really talk about how do we make this better? How do we make this whole experience better? And I think coming from the outside, I sort of, at some level, especially when we talk about the traditional Salesforce clouds like service, sales, marketing, those types of things, I don't see them as being as differentiated as we do internally in order to parcel out the work to build them. I just experience them as a customer. So it's just all Salesforce. So sometimes when I see sort of these edges that don't quite meet between the clouds, I'm like, well, of course they should meet. We should figure out how to make them meet. And it's not that people don't want to do it. It's that it's just that fresh set of eyes looking at it where people are, when you point it out, they're like, oh, wow, yeah, we should probably make sure that that connects. So our customers don't have to do the thing that you did to get those two things to connect externally. And I think that goes into the customer zero side of it. It prepares me for the customer zero side, which is by implementing the things that we are building, I'm going back with notes and saying like, look, this went really well. This didn't go so well, or this is confusing, or this took us 3 tries to get it to work the way that you intended it to work. Maybe it's an education thing. Maybe it's some change in the interface. Maybe it's some underlying service that's coordinating, whatever it is. But to have an organization in the chief digital office side that is as good as the rest of the technology teams, and as versed in the product development lifecycle, like I've built products my entire life essentially. Being able to go and talk to the folks, meet them where they're at, they meet you where you're at. It's just this force multiplier kind of virtuous cycle that we get. So as you said, the sort of, the advantage is you start from that place and then you get to do the real work. I think if there's any disadvantages to it, it's just, there's a lot of engineering talent. Not all engineers agree all the time. So there's still a lot of debate on these things about what's the right way to do things. But, the nice thing about engineering debates is like at some point, the light bulb kind of either goes on or it doesn't go on. And so, you can figure out a way of experimenting your way into it or testing it or doing some more research. Like it is an empirical pursuit for the most part. It's a knowable thing. And I think that's one of the things that when you have peers that are very skilled and have opinions on these things, it's great to actually just debate them, because I do think that sort of Socratic process gets you great product. And like I said, a lot of our stuff's testable, so we may agree to disagree. Let's go test it. Let's agree on the test design and let's go figure out what works. And that's part of what my team does in some cases, is where I can jump ahead of the product a little bit and like, look, we internally have some debate about if we should go to A or B or C. And it's like, okay, well, let's build a lightweight version of A, B, and C and put it in front of people and see what happens, and measure, and like the proof is in the pudding, so to speak. And I think that's really cool. That's a fun thing to do. And we do it at such scale and at such velocity. It's one of those things that's really, it's quite joyous because you can see things just come to fruition so much faster than I thought was really possible before I got inside the company.
Fascinating observations. I appreciate you sharing those, Joe. I wanted to also ask you, as somebody who's had consequential roles across now multiple meaningful organizations, but as we discussed earlier, also now have critical touch points with a number of companies that are customers of Salesforce. What do you see as differentiating factors for those companies that maximize the value of AI generally, Agentic more specifically? What are some of the foundational elements they have in place, or perhaps put a little bit differently, what do you see as accelerators or governors to progress relative to some of the topics we've talked about?
I think it's a great question. I'll give you sort of 2 answers to it. I think the first one is I talk about this sort of maturity curve that people go on, and it really starts with mechanization. If Agentics is sort of stage 4 and you want to get started, like you have to have the data mechanized. And so, you'd be surprised, but a lot of people still have like, maybe not analog, but let's call it landlocked repositories of information. In some cases, it is analog. It's like, well, we have these order sheets and then somebody keys them in. It's like, well, that's not really mechanization. So you have to kind of get the mechanization, like get the data flowing into systems of record in a way that's structured and or it could be unstructured too, but in a way that's governed, that you understand. And then once you do that, you can start to run automation on it. And you can start to say, okay, well, when this process starts, I want this other one, or stops, I want this other one to start. That's really the automation phase. And then people, after that generally got into some sort of machine learning. So once I have automation, then I can figure out how to put machine learning around that and sort of measure things and just improve that by having the computer optimized. And then you get to sort of generative AI and agentics and things like that. So perhaps unsurprisingly, the companies that were already in stage 3 find the leap to stage 4 much easier. Companies who haven't even done stage 1, like you're not going to get an agent that comes and just like do your job button and fixes the fact that you haven't got through the mechanization stage. So I think you definitely have to get mechanization down. You probably have to have some automation. The third stage, I think at this point, you could argue that depending on the company, you might actually skip and just go straight to Agentics. But those first 2 are really essential. And so I think companies that have built data lakes that have tried to put some of that process government, that have gotten some amount of leverage on automation and things like that, are typically come in much better prepared. And companies, your mileage can vary. So we back to like what agents do well versus humans. Yeah, humans can live in ambiguity. We don't tend to like it so much, but we can live in it in a pretty reasonable way. But if you have two different documents, one says, yeah, yes, this is true, and the other one says that's absolutely false. And you feed those into a retrieval augmentation call that an AI is going to use, it's going to give you weird answers, right? Because the machine is going to do its best to answer those things with directly conflicting information that you've given it, and it's going to be weird. And a lot of times people will be like, oh, it hallucinated. And it's like, well, that's not really a hallucination. That's data pollution. And so what people find, and I certainly found when I was at previous places doing this type of thing, and I see it at Salesforce too, is that, companies have technical debt. So you find like one web page that you didn't even really know exists, but still was in the public website that had this incorrect information. So going through the process of maturing the agent actually helps you clean up the data, because when you have these errant results, you start to track them down and you're like, oh, wow, I didn't realize we still had stuff that said that, or I didn't realize this help article hadn't been updated, or I didn't realize that. And that hygiene side of it goes. So if you have better hygiene and you have better automation, and you're especially if you're on that stage 3, then like for you to get to Agentics is a lot easier. What we're trying to do with the product is we're really trying to, get that barrier of entry much lower, especially for folks that are already Salesforce customers. And so our technology like Data Cloud with Agentforce and things like that can really help you connect the dots in a way that's not burdensome to our customers. At least that's the goal. And I believe we're paying off that goal quite a bit, but it still doesn't deal with the data pollution side. So if you have multiple systems of record, you're still gonna have to go in and sort that out at some level. And the AI can help you identify it, but it's not gonna necessarily resolve those things. So I think that's kind of like the curve, I would say. The second part, I would say, as a totally just separate issue, I always tell people who are technologists, especially, never fall in love with the technology, always fall in love with a process to use technology, because technology will break your heart every time. The number of languages and frameworks and types of computers that I loved over my career, are all heartbreak at this point in time, because technology marches on. You can't be a technologist and opposed to change, because technology always changes. And so if you sort of fall in love with the process of using new technology and the process of learning, and you become like a lifelong student and learner of technology, then you're also set up for this AI world, because the AI world and the agentic world is really going to shred some of your conceptions of how things have to be done, because it is just such a different technology. And so if you're really sort of like, oh, no, everything's got to be in a tabular relational database, then it's like, this Gen AI stuff doesn't really use that as well as it uses unstructured data and vector databases, all this new stuff that goes along with it. So I think a lot of it's also the mentality is, individual mentality, which then leads to corporate mentality of you have to embrace the change, because it is really different. And like I said, we try to make the tools more accessible to make that change easier, but you really do have to embrace the change. And I think a lot of companies that wanted it to work, but were unwilling to change what they were doing, those are the companies that really had failed projects.
Terrific observations. Thank you, Joe. Naturally, our conversation is focused a lot on artificial intelligence, agentic progress, and the like. I wonder, as you look to the future, what other trends, adjacent ones or completely distinct ones, have you excited as you think about what's to come? What comes to mind?
Well, I actually kind of think about the consumerization of technology. For a long time, there was sort of consumer and then there was not, right? There was consumer and there was professional. There's enterprise software and then there's not enterprise software. And I think the real kind of inflection point to me was the iPhone. And so if you think about BlackBerry, I was a huge BlackBerry user. I had multiple versions. I had a BlackBerry Flip. That's how progressive I was. It didn't even have a full QWERTY keyboard, right? But these were technologies, back to the ones that broke your heart, that I thought was the pinnacle of technology. And then I saw an iPhone and I was like, oh, wow, well, this is different. And you look at what the smartphone has done, Apple obviously pioneering it, Google coming fast and furious. And all of a sudden the BlackBerry's reaction initially was like, well, we're a business company and that's a toy. We're like a really serious business company. And now you don't find any BlackBerries in business and you find a lot of iPhones. And I think that notion that like the direction of technology is more consumerization of things is really interesting. And so we talk about it internally, and I talk about it internally as well as like the consumer quality interfaces, like this consumer direct to consumer quality interfaces. And I think, coming from the streaming business, I see that. I lived through that war. Like I'm one of the few people that was, born at a time where I'm just as, an RJ45 Ethernet jack and a BNC, video cable are just as comfortable for me to hold. I hold a lot less BNC cables at this point in my career because one of them clearly won. But when you think about television was the least consumer interface things, right? You had a number for the most part. That's the way you interacted with it. You decided to go and pick a number and then watch or listen to whatever they gave you on that number at the time they gave it to you. And now you look at where you're at with the consumerization side of it. You take Disney Plus, which I had the pleasure of being the CTO and building. That's got a lot of choice. It's got personalization. It's got all of these features that make it a radically different experience than linear television. So it wasn't as much streaming won. It was the consumerization that won. Streaming just happened to be the way in which it got built. And I think that's happening all over the place. So I look at what we're doing, trying to make the technology more accessible, trying to ground those experiences in these consumer grade experiences is one of the things that's a lot of what we're working on right now. And I think Agentic is only going to blur that even more. It's funny. I was talking to my friends that have kids, maybe 10 years ago, and they were talking about after the iPad came up and their kids sort of grew up with iPads, that they would go and touch the TV screen and not understand why it didn't react, because to them, like, well, TV is this thing you touch, right? Because they're used to an iPad. I was just talking a couple of weekends ago with some friends that have young kids right now, and they were traveling and staying at a hotel, and the kid tried to talk to the Alexa. And of course, there's no Alexa in the hotel room, but that child didn't think about like the Alexa as a physical device that sat in the room. It was just somebody you talked to when you wanted to play music or things like that. And I think that's consumerization of technology. And I think agents are going to make that so much more ubiquitous. If you drive a car now and you hit the button, that the voice control in a car, and, you tell it to change the one OEM that will remain nameless of a car I own, actually is using ChatGPT. I know because of my time at Sirius, they're using ChatGPT behind the curtain. But, I asked it to raise the temperature in the car. It could do it. And then I asked it a question to convert miles into kilometers because I was looking at a road sign, and it barfed. And I was like, wait, how did that happen? Why doesn't it know the answer to that? Like, it's a large model. It should totally know the answer to it. And so I think people's expectations are just going to get to it. Like, if you have a voice interface, it better be able to answer most questions for you. And that's just the way it's going to be, because people are just going to, the bar is going to get raised. And so I think that's the other exciting trend. Agentic is clearly a part of it, but it's also the quality of the interface, the interaction model, the sort of way you buy, the way you interact with it. All of those things, I think, are the bend of technology is going towards the consumerization side, and we're all consumers at this point.
Fascinating. I wanted to also ask you, as someone who's clearly immersed in a lot of innovative topics, what do you read, watch, and or listen to remain current on those topics? Anything you'd recommend to peers or others who are watching or listening to this that you find particularly helpful?
It's a great question. I actually got that question on one of my town halls recently, where I had like an all hands meeting, and it came from the crowd. And I think there's, for me personally, I can only answer personally, there's certainly a bunch of stuff. I listen to this podcast, I read this site, I look at this blog and things like that. And there's some of those types of things, but I don't think there's any substitute for two things, which is talk to your friends about it. Like, when you talk to other people that are in the field technologically, like, you learn. Every time I talk to somebody, I learn. And I love that. And I think it's always reciprocal. Like, no matter who you're talking to, it could be an intern, you're going to learn some stuff. That's why I think mentorship is so important, because you kind of mentor in both ways. Like, you get mentored too, right? In a whole new viewpoint. So I'd say that's number one. And number two is just do it. It's the practitioner side of it. So, Nobody will let me near a code repository for my own good at this point in time to actually check in production code. But I still write a lot of code in my personal life, and I intentionally take on projects or pick technologies I want to use for a product or project that I'm doing in the house of something that I am using technologically. So like I've written, agentic applications using Agentforce to do stuff to just see how it works, in my current role. But just that practitioner, I think it's a tendency as we get older, and I've seen it in a lot of technologists as they get older, that they're just like, yep, that was the last one. That was the last language I could learn. Like I was a Java guy, and now like, this Python, all the kids are, go write a project in Python and just experience it, just interact with it. And even if you're not super technical, just play with ChatGPT, start asking it questions. I gave the example, I love to cook. And I have gotten better at cooking over the years, both because I cook with my friends that are chefs, but also I now use ChatGPT a lot to talk to it about recipes. And, rarely does it's just give me a recipe. It's sort of like, well, what happened if I cooked that at 425, and like, let it answer the question. And I think, on the agentic side, like everybody hopefully has a hobby. And if you have a hobby, it's probably hard to imagine that there's not a font of knowledge that you could gain by just having a conversation with the technology that's out there. So be a practitioner. And if you be a practitioner, you're going to learn. It's just impossible not to learn. But I think that's it, like network and practitioner. And then, all the reading and the, individual blogs and podcasts and all that are great sources. But that is something you can bring to the table when you have the conversation with your friends, because you're all going to have different ones.
Great suggestions. Like both of those. And certainly important for all of us to think about that. Talk to your friends, learn in the field, as you said, and then be a practitioner and get your hands dirty in the areas also. Well, Joe, thank you for a really terrific and deep conversation on a variety of topics. Fascinating to hear more about your role, the great innovations you're leveraging as well as developing. It's been great to hear from you, and thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, thanks for having me, Peter. It's been a pleasure.